Old enough to remember the old world, young enough to build a life in the new one. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, you remember both rotary phones and the first iPhone launch. You are what researchers call a Xennial. And if you've ever felt too old for one group and too young for another, you're not confused. You're not in between. You're something very specific. Spoiler alert, there's a reason you can navigate both the analog and digital world, and neuroscience finally has an explanation. Stay with me because this goes deeper than you think. Here's the thing. From the start, your life was split in two. The first half was analog. You memorized phone numbers. You waited all week for your favorite show, because if you missed it, you missed it. You called your friend's house and had to talk to their parents first, and when you went outside, you stayed outside until the streetlights came on. Think about it. As a child, you listened to music on cassette tapes. As a teenager, you burned CDs. By your mid-20s, everything was digital. You went from blowing into Nintendo cartridges to holding a smartphone that could access every piece of information ever created, all before you turned 30. And then the second half arrived, not gradually, overnight. The world changed and you changed with it. That wasn't a boring childhood. That was a training ground for patience. And your social life? That required a completely different kind of skill. You passed notes in class. You made plans on Monday for Friday and actually showed up. You knocked on someone's door and asked if they could come out. No read receipts, no backup plans. You said you'd be there, and you were. That wasn't naivety. That was genuine trust. And trust was the default. But while all of this was happening on the outside, something was happening inside your brain that scientists didn't fully understand until recently. In 2004, neuroscientist Nitin Gogtai at the National Institutes of Health mapped how the cortex matures from back to front and found that the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for decision-making and adapting to change, doesn't fully develop until around age 25. For Xennials, this is critical. Your prefrontal cortex was still forming during one of the biggest technological shifts in human history. Sarah Jane Blakemore at University College London calls adolescence a second window of opportunity, a period when the brain is exceptionally plastic, rewiring itself based on whatever environment surrounds it. Your brain was still highly moldable when the digital revolution hit, old enough to absorb it naturally, young enough to remember what came before. And psychologist Ellen Bialstock at York University found that managing two competing systems enhances cognitive flexibility. Think of it this way. You became bilingual, not in languages, in worlds. You're fluent face-to-face and fluent digital. You remember what it felt like to be genuinely unreachable. I can troubleshoot the Wi-Fi for my parents and write a handwritten thank you note in the same afternoon. My brain just switches modes. Now, to be clear, tech bilingualism is not a clinical term. It's a metaphor. But the cognitive science behind it is real. Your brain learned to operate across two completely different worlds. And that kind of flexibility, most people never develop it. That's not being caught between two generations. That's neurological bilingualism. Wild, right? And that adaptability didn't just change how you think. It changed something more personal. How you remember. Your generation has a different relationship with privacy. Your embarrassing moments faded naturally. No screenshots, no digital archive, no evidence trail following you into adulthood. You grew up in a world where the past was allowed to blur. Konstantin Siddiqides at the University of Southampton proved that nostalgia isn't weakness. It causally strengthens self-continuity. Your brain is designed to edit memories, keep what matters, release the rest. But social media documentation is making that natural process harder for everyone who came after you. Those fading memories aren't loss, they're freedom. But freedom doesn't protect you from everything, and for your generation, the biggest test wasn't digital, it was economic. If you turned 18 around the year 2000, your childhood doesn't just feel like another time. It feels like another life, another person, another world. And just as you were starting to build your career, the 2008 financial crisis hit. Not a recession your parents talked about, one you lived through during the exact years you were supposed to be finding your footing. Economist Paola Giuliano published a working paper through the National Bureau of Economic Research in 2009 that found something powerful. Experiencing a recession during your formative years shapes your beliefs about money and risk for life. Even when things improved, the question, what if it all falls apart again, kept running in the background. And sociologist Jalen Mortimer's longitudinal research confirms this pattern. Young adults who enter the workforce during a recession show lasting financial caution, resourcefulness, and what researchers describe as pragmatic resilience. You didn't just lose money, you lost certainty during the exact window when certainty was supposed to be forming. That financial anxiety isn't weakness, it's survival intelligence. So here's the question no one asks. When you can adapt to anything, what happens to the parts of you that never got to just be? I feel too old for TikTok and too young for Facebook. I'm exhausted by both generations claiming me while neither one actually gets me. If that sounds familiar, there's a reason. You carry the self-reliance and skepticism of Generation X. You grew up before helicopter parenting was a thing, but you also embraced the optimism of the early internet age. Independent and cooperative, skeptical yet hopeful, digital but deeply analog. You hold these contradictions not because something's wrong with you, but because you lived them. Psychologist Erik Erikson mapped this exact tension. At your stage of life, between 40 and 50, the question isn't who you are, it's what you'll leave behind. He called it generativity versus stagnation. And here's what most people miss. Holding contradictions isn't confusion, it's the highest form of cognitive maturity. I see you, holding it all together, translating between two worlds every single day. And I need you to hear this. You're not contradictory, you're complete. But, and this is important, I'm not going to pretend that everything about this is easy. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes I don't fit anywhere becomes a comfortable excuse. Sometimes adaptability becomes avoidance. If you keep shape-shifting to fit every room, you might forget which shape is actually yours. The question isn't whether you can adapt, you've proven that. The question is whether you're adapting or hiding. So which one is it? Let's find out. Here's what I know. You lost something. The ability to be truly alone. The patience that came from waiting. The presence you had when nothing competed for your attention. But you also gained something most people never will. Connection without boundaries. Information without limits. Possibilities that didn't exist when you were 10. You didn't lose yourself between two worlds. You found yourself in both. You could survive a digital shutdown tomorrow, and you could build a startup next week, not because you're caught between two worlds, but because you're fluent in both. So if you've been told you don't fit anywhere, they were wrong. You fit everywhere. That's the point. This isn't an identity crisis. It's an identity advantage. Living through a massive transition taught you something most people are still trying to learn: how to adapt without